Street Fighter 6 is really, really good. That's probably not a huge surprise to you if you've been following FGC Twitter, for example, but plenty of people play Street Fighter 5 and checked out. Well, guess what? It's time to check back in. Because we've been playing Street Fighter 6 for over a week, and frankly, there's plenty of reason to believe that it's the greatest Street Fighter game ever, especially if you're a first-time player. So Street Fighter 6 is a really good game, as I've already said, but what makes something the best in its series? Well, why don't you try just making combat both deep and interesting, while at the same time giving new players a great spot to jump into the series. Obviously, fighting games are a pretty intimidating genre, but this one is doing so much to both bring back old fans and bring in people who may never have even thought about taking a fighting game seriously. The big mechanical change for returning players is the drive system, which basically gives you access to a bunch of skills similar to ones from old Street Fighter games at the cost of Drive Meter. Drive Impact is another new addition, and it's this big wound up armored attack that helps you close the distance with your opponent and break through their armor. While some people will say this probably feels the most scrubby of the new additions, I think for a new fighting game player, something like this makes kind of intuitive sense in a way that will help them approach the game. The most important thing about the drive system is that you come into a round with basically all of your character's tools instead of having to wait halfway through the round for you to have been beaten up enough to have your comeback mechanic or whatever. You choose how you use those resources at the beginning of the round. One of the biggest complaints about Street Fighter V was that it felt like a round didn't really start until someone lost half their life, because that's when they got their V-meter and they had access to all these other fun tools. Street Fighter 6 just says, here you go. Here are the fun tools and do what you want with them. The characters in this game have pretty big move lists compared to other Street Fighter games. They feel pretty complex and they have interesting variations on things that you've come to expect. It leads to a really fast-paced game where characters have a ton of crazy combos and lots of flexibility for each player to approach them any way they want to. Basically, it's the exact opposite of Street Fighter V, at least at launch. Now, maybe you've already caught on to the fact that I both said that this game is new for beginners, but also that the move lists are deep, in fact, maybe more complex than any other Street Fighter game to date. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first off, let's talk about modern controls. Basically, the new modern control scheme removes all input requirements from special moves. So you don't have to do a quarter circle to throw a fireball with Ryu anymore. You can just hit the special button, kind of like how special moves work in a game like Smash Bros. A lot of hardcore fighting game players are upset with the ease of modern controls, I guess, but it does have drawbacks. You do less damage overall, and your options are just more limited than somebody playing with classic controls. But you know what? Having said that, some pro players are experimenting with modern over classic. I think it's a sign that Capcom has really made something special with modern controls. It won't be for everybody, but it's cool that you're not actually handicapping yourself and that it's more a different style of play, one that will make things much easier for new players. So new players will have this option when they start playing, which will let them approach the game before feeling like it's shutting them out. While at the same time, if you're an old head, you're probably playing on, you know, a stick, maybe a fight pad, or even just a normal pad, and you're gonna be using classic controls. You'll have all the flexibility and options that you're used to. It's a good deal. But that's not the only thing that Capcom is doing for new players. There's an entire brand new single player mode, and I know what you're thinking, fighting game single player modes, but no, this one is deep and it helps new players learn about fighting games. Listen, if you've ever played a single player mode in a fighting game, then I'm sure you're aware that typically there just isn't much there. Usually we're talking about some kind of pseudo arcade mode, sometimes with some kind of cool gimmick thrown in, like think like Tekken 7's treasure hunt mode, for example. But Street Fighter 6 has this purpose-built single player mode where you run around an open world and learn how to play fighting games. And it's sweet. The open-ended world tour mode lets you design your own weird fighter, learn styles from Street Fighter characters, explore Metro City, and then start street fights with anyone willing to throw down. Sure, it's deeply unserious. It's almost like Street Fighter meets Yakuza in a sense, Like, spinning bird kick is a traversal tool. You can literally have a friendly fight with the cops or someone enjoying their Starbucks on the way to the office, and at night people with boxes on their heads will literally attack you on sight. But World Tour also acts as this no pressure introduction to fighting games by explaining these new modern controls alongside core fighting game concepts like canceling moves or overhead attacks. You also learn characters in a way by adding their styles and some of their moves to your own. And if World Tour does succeed at getting a player to log into the Battle Hub and try playing against other people, well, Capcom has made that experience very good as well. The move list for characters in this game got a massive glow up. It shows you not only a video of the move and its variations, but it also gives you some tips on how to actually use it. I know that sounds obvious, but most of the time the move list was literally just the inputs and the move name. That's it. You figure out how to use it. If you go even deeper and consult the character guide for a fighter you're interested in, you get a great surface level walkthrough. So for a new player, the command list used to just show the what. Now it also helps with the how and the why. But the character guide also takes that responsibility away from the player, at least initially, by explaining a character's game plan and how their moves fit into that. For once in my life, I'd have no reservations telling a new player, listen, find a character you think is cool and then just complete their in-game character guide. Because even if they don't learn a ton about the actual process of playing the character, at least they will have some inputs that they know are useful, that they know are kind of the go-to things for this character. World Tour and the new player experience are probably a little bigger than they strictly speaking need to be. But at the same time, it has such potential to bring in new players that I can't help but love World Tour for that fact alone. And if along the way I get to punch out a mime while looking like Sam Bankman-Fried, well, that's even better. But what's in store for those new players who take advantage of these tools that I just mentioned and do finally make the jump to online? Well, I've got Sean to explain that to all you fine folks.
Hey. So there's one more important thing to talk about, and that's the netcode. So unlike my colleagues, I'm pretty much exclusively an online warrior. I live about 2 hours away from the closest local, and I interact with fighting games more or less entirely online. I've played more Street Fighter V than any other fighting game. And if you're like me, you know that playing it online was pretty awful sometimes. And that came down to the netcode, which connected you to your opponents. Japanese fighting games have a history of kind of bad online play, which is why netcode has been one of the biggest talking points in the fighting game community for years. And I am so happy to report that in Street Fighter 6, the netcode is great. So as I'm recording this, I've sunk about 27 hours into the game. That time has been spent entirely in training mode, combo trials, and playing online games. And in all that time, I haven't had a single connection that I consider unplayable. If you spend a lot of time on social media, you've probably seen folks making a big deal of the fact that some NA players have been able to connect with Japan pretty reliably. So I decided to test that out for myself. I went into one of the busiest Asian region lobbies and played against 2 players with over 200 ping that were likely in or around Japan. And it was fine. Sure, it was noticeably worse than a local NA connection, but it was honestly better or on par with anything that I would have expected back in Street Fighter V. My opponents were hitting their combos, and any combos that I managed to drop were a skill problem, not a game problem, I promise. In 5 or 6 games, I dropped less than 10 frames to Japan. That's not good netcode, it's witchcraft. And back home in NA, 3-bar players with around 70 ping that would have tormented me back in 5 felt stable and playable. This is a huge deal for a scene that has had to meet in person to play their games seriously for decades. I'm so excited that I can finally have real online play, but mostly I'm just happy that I can mash my supers in peace.
So there you have it. We think Street Fighter 6 is pretty great. We've all been playing it around the office. Some of us have been focusing on different parts of it, but in the end, we think there's a lot to love. And after a long era of people being justifiably pretty down on Street Fighter, it feels good to have this new game that's rallying the community in ways that honestly seemed implausible a few years ago. If you've never played a fighting game before, this is a perfect place for you to start. I'm not kidding. And if you have played and perhaps left because of Street Fighter V, listen, they did a lot to the game. I think you owe it a shot here. By the way, play World Tour just to see the character intros for these characters. They're awesome. Like, DJ's literally just on a beach DJing. You're like, I need to learn from you. And he's like, all right, here's how we dance. And you're like, no, I want to fight, bro. And he's like, okay. Like, it's so good. You should try it, is all I'm saying. You should try it.